Thank you and welcome everyone to this presentation on the driverless city. This city of the future is a result of multiple research studies that use both top-down and bottom-up approaches. So let's kick things off with the following question. How will automated vehicles impact and shape the way cities are designed and built in the future? So spoiler alert, there is not a single answer to this question. Will the driverless city look like this? This is a utopic, ideal, best case scenario. This is what a driverless city in the future might look like if all the promises of autonomous vehicles come true. Cities are complex and messy systems. There's many interconnected and interdependent components within and without. So let me draw some boundaries just for the purposes of this talk. We'll be talking about SAE levels 4 and 5 of automation, drawing a boundary line, leaving a few things out of scope, but still directly related and interacting with the system. So let's look at some of the key aspects that will be affected by automated vehicles in the future. This is a result of an extensive review of more than 300 books, reports, journals, articles, and white papers. I've divided these up into 10 major aspects. Let's start with the battle for the curb. The curb is this liminal space where the pedestrian becomes a cyclist or a driver and vice versa. Shares many competing interests between parking for bikes and scooters, cyclist thoroughfare, taxi and rideshare pickups and drop-offs, transit pickups and drop-offs, vehicle parking, cargo loading and unloading. It is a very hotly contested piece of real estate. Not too long ago, Uber commissioned Furr and Pierce to study the curb, and they came up with a curb productivity index, which is a relation of the space that is allotted for a specific use and the amount of passengers per space hour that those uses allow. So as you can see, bus provides the greatest number of passengers per space hour compared to a parked car. Yet the curb allocation, the actual amount of space that each one of these modes takes up in a curb, is not actually a direct relation to the number of people that move through it. So broader conclusion is that currently the curb is not working the way it is set out to function. Now, this hotly contested piece of real estate is going to become even more so when instead of parking, vehicles will only be dropping off and picking up passengers, where every stretch, every meter of the curb could potentially be a place where driverless vehicles drop off and pick up passengers. Now, in places like airports, train stations, and sports fields, they've already begun experimenting with different designs of PUDO, or pick-up and drop-off areas and locations. Although most of these still rely on parking, and the areas that they're dedicating to these PUDO setups are also just converted parking. So the real issue is going to be what happens in a busy downtown street where you don't have swaths of asphalt to try to create pickup and drop-off zones with the space that airports and train stations have. Road space, or right-of-way. Most of the images you tend to see about the future of automated vehicles are vehicles that are narrower, take up fewer lanes, so there's more space available for other uses. This is a utopic best case scenario where the lanes are reduced in both number and space because AVs are narrower, they require less space between the vehicles, and they're even capable of sharing opposite direction lanes as they become available. However, this scenario is highly dependent on a future where automated vehicles are populated by shared fleets instead of individual ownership, where the actual number of vehicles on the road is substantially lower. Parking demand on streets may be reduced that way with a decrease in vehicle size. This illustration by NACTO's blueprint for autonomous urbanism is one of many that you'll see about this idyllic future. But where did all the people go? Where is the bustle of a downtown core? Where is the city filled with people and cars? It is a vision of the future through rose-tinted glasses, very ideal, serene, and peaceful without any of the chaos and bustle of most city cores. This is more likely what the future city would look like, especially if we don't take matters into our own hands. This is what a downtown core of cars continuously trying to pick up and drop off passengers, cutting in front of each other without coordination between them could look like. And while many of these illustrations show extended sidewalks and repurposed lanes, This is not quite as simple as it seems. It's quite easy to do when it comes to illustration, but it takes a lot more than just throwing concrete on top of asphalt. It is actually extremely costly to move the curb because it affects a lot of underground infrastructure, such as storm drains and fire hydrants. So this is not quite as easy as the illustrations make it seem. Also, the opposite could come true, and AVs may shift user preferences towards larger vehicles that permit other activities such as beds, showers, kitchens, offices. And so instead of automated vehicles taking up less space, they actually end up taking more. So the most likely scenario is that some of the space that will be freed up from, let's say, on-street parking would just be used to expand thoroughfare, hopefully through things like bike lanes, but would more likely be taken up by PUDO or pick up and drop off locations. How about the other right-of-way users? Speaking of space and right-of-way, most of you have surely seen this graphic or even a more modern reinterpretation of it that illustrates the amount of space taken up by the same number of people depending on the mode of transportation that they use. This is a newer graphic also by NACTO that provides a little more detail regarding the thoroughfare, the amount of space that it would be required to move 10,000 people per hour. And moving people through the air is still very much a pipe dream. Something that in the shortest term will only be useful for those that are still within the small fraction of wealthier population. And this is still missing out on other modes of transportation, some of them which have just recently surfaced in the last couple of years. Greatest point of interaction between other road users and automated vehicles will be on intersections. Now, many of you have seen illustrations or graphics like this depicting a whizzing, mathematically amazing cars zooming by each other without ever having to come to a stop. Now, realistically, this might work for, say, to recover some of the land that's been lost to the enormous sprawling intersection of highways. But it would definitely not work in the downtown core where pedestrians, cyclists, people with strollers and wheelchairs need to navigate intersections and cross streets. This is something that we currently do using eye contact and other nonverbal cues. Now, there's an interesting scenario where pedestrians actually start acting with impunity towards automated vehicles, stepping onto the streets without a second thought and constantly halting traffic. This in turn leading governments and other policymakers to further prioritize cars over people in order to allow them to move through cities. Now, it's true that automated vehicles still have a long way to go before they're actually as safe or even safer than a human vehicle. Some manufacturers more than others. However, ultimately, the issue of vehicle safety will sort itself out. If people do not trust automated vehicles, they will never be adopted. So the industry will be the one that ensures vehicles are safe. The current energy and efforts of authorities should be focused on issues of inclusion, accessibility, and fairness, issues that have been historically brushed aside or deprioritized. How will automated vehicles work with and ensure not only the safety, but the inclusion of all other right-of-way users? Many infrastructure investments and announcements that have been made recently take very little notice of vehicle automation as an issue. Now, keep in mind that these are projected several decades into the future. If automated vehicles of the future are also electric vehicles, this has serious implications for the city's power grid. Digital infrastructure as well. Although a connected vehicle is not the same thing as an autonomous vehicle, many of the promises that automated vehicles are purporting require or are dependent on this connectivity, such as improving traffic congestion. One of the biggest things that automated vehicles are promising to do is to actually require less parking and free up the space for other users. Some of it might end up being converted in ways similar to what this image illustrates. Although, as discussed before, most of the on-street parking will more likely be turned into pick-up and drop-off zones and maybe thoroughfare bike lanes. Off-street parking, such as in public or private garages, however, is a different issue. And since automated vehicles won't require the same space for passengers to open doors and get in and out, and they might even allow multiple vehicles to be stacked, this could free up a lot of space in commercial buildings, potentially for new commercial or office uses. Similarly, what happens to private residential parking? What about driveways and single-family homes? In a shared vehicle scenario, The same thing would apply to residential parking as it does to commercial downtown parking. So what could these garages now be converted to? Could they be turned into studio space or a workshop? Or how about extra living space? Or how about this modern day setup where a garage has been turned into a standalone apartment and rented out for additional income? One of the biggest concerns of public planners is that automated vehicles will actually draw away from public transportation, and rightfully so. But there are several ways that automated vehicles could potentially affect this. The first one is actual integration, where public transit itself incorporates autonomy or driverless systems. There's also the idea that automated vehicles might actually supplement public transportation. Currently, in many cities worldwide, there are many transit deserts that are underserved by public transit. And so there's the idea that automated vehicles could potentially supplement this. However, there's several problems with this theory. If you're in one of these transit deserts, for example, and you're paying rideshare to take you to a mass transit line, you would only need to pay a little bit extra for that ride to take you all the way downtown, and you'd be saving a lot of time and inconvenience. There's also the idea that an 8 to 12 person shuttle could be used in these transit deserts. However, transit agents are currently not doing this. They don't have the means or the budget to provide this service. What is going to change in the future that would allow them to suddenly afford this? Road traffic regulations were designed for use by humans, and the idea is that they will ultimately be replaced by protocols. This would also require fewer resources to police the roads. However, the changes to traffic laws have so far mostly been to allow testing or operation. Most of the literature's recommendations are also focused on unblocking innovation and allowing testing to take place. Yet there's a myriad of laws that are governing licensing and registration, driver education and training, insurance and liability that will require a complete overhaul. And then there's new potential behaviors that require legislation and regulation. For example, custom modifications that allow you to override a vehicle's behavior. Just like jailbreaking a phone, what if you jailbreak your car and allow it to do things such as speeding? What about the behavior of humans that are not inside the vehicle? We'll need legislation that outlaws malicious behavior directed at automated vehicles, like hacking, new laws addressing people that disrupt vehicular software or hardware. Speed limits in many jurisdictions set artificially low with the expectations that drivers will actually be driving over the limit. So should automated vehicles be driving at the speed limit, which means they would be actually moving slower than traffic? Or should they be driving faster than the speed limit because their technology is more adequate at handling those speeds than even a human can? Automated vehicles will also have to give consideration to emergency circumstances when it may be necessary to perform maneuvers which may otherwise violate traffic laws, such as following the directions of police officers to cross double yellow lines or drive on a sidewalk in order to avoid hazards such as a crash scene or a flooded road or debris. The common expectation is that automated vehicles will automatically do a better job of yielding to emergency vehicles. This will be even more efficient when vehicles themselves are connected in the case of a CAV. However, the true disruption will be when the vehicles themselves are automated. In the case of ambulances, this would free up both paramedics to be with the patient. And it's not just emergency vehicles that could be innovative. There's a myriad of fleet services that include refuse collection, street cleaning, parking enforcement, water irrigation, loaders, bulldozers, garbage trucks, snow plows, and many more, where automation could truly disrupt the way they've traditionally functioned. One of the most tragic developments of North America is that of suburban housing. Cities in North America are relatively younger compared to those in other parts of the world. They developed with the automobile and thus dependent on the automobile. And this has led to some very ridiculous planning and distribution of land. In this example, the two houses on the map are actually back to back. Here's a close-up view of this example. These two houses are almost back to back, but they don't actually share a wall. So let's say that you and your brother or sister have decided to buy houses in the same neighborhood, but you do not get along with these neighbors. So if you actually wanted to visit each other, you would not be able to walk through their house. Even though they're within meters of each other, you'd actually have to hop in a car and drive for 16 minutes in order to do just that. North America is littered with many of these ridiculous examples. In 1994, an Italian physicist called Cesare Marchetti described an idea that has come to be known as a Marchetti constant, which is people have always been willing to commute for approximately half an hour one way from their homes each day. In Rome, for example, people were willing to walk half an hour in the morning and half an hour in the evening from their homes to their place of work every day. The same was true for Paris. In London, with the introduction of railways, this allowed for people that were further away to also get to their place of work within about approximately half an hour. Chicago, a streetcar city, allowed people to move to and from their home and place of work in approximately the same time through the faster streetcars. A city such as Atlanta, which was built around the automobile, allows you to do the same thing if you own a car. So what do we achieve by building new highways and speeding up travel? We don't actually shorten people's trips. We just enable them to live and work further away from each other. The worst part of it is that we are pricing the ability to go to places quickly over the actual value of the places that we're trying to go. On average, we drove almost twice as far each day in 2017 as we did just in 1982. This map of Buffalo, New York from the Rice Collective illustrates this ridiculous contradiction really well. Physical growth from 1950 to 2010 was a staggering tripling of the developed land area. However, during the same amount of time, there was a zero net population growth. This is just the same number of people taking up 3 times as much space. As I said before, this is not unique of North America, but very characteristic of it. Instead of modernizing medieval cities, we felt that we could just keep growing indefinitely on all this empty land around us. Sprawling cities like these are extremely expensive to maintain. This graphic shows a staggering difference in cost to infrastructure to suburban areas compared to urban areas. This is not just physical infrastructure such as roadways or water, but things such as police and fire departments cost several times more in a suburban setting than an urban one. The greatest fear of urban planners is that automated vehicles will encourage and exacerbate urban sprawl by making the daily commute a lot more bearable and encourage people to live even further away where housing is cheaper. Other experts argue that automated vehicles in a shared model will actually be too expensive to be used in that manner, and so they will actually encourage densification and more people coming to the downtown core. However, the most likely scenario pointed out by very keen experts is that both things will actually occur. The periphery of the city will sprawl out even further while the downtown core increases in density. This will result in cities that look more like New York with very high dense cores and very sprawled out suburban areas around it. Coupled with the fear of urban sprawl is also that automated vehicles will actually increase congestion and clog vehicular arteries. All illustrations and scenarios of futures with automated vehicles are very utopic, which will happen only if the predominant future of automated vehicles is a shared model instead of individual ownership, coupled with the integration and availability of public transit instead of automated vehicles competing and degrading it. So these are scenarios where ownership is too expensive for insurance reasons, where transportation network companies have been the first out of the gate. Even traditional auto manufacturers and OEMs are talking more and more about shared and service models than actual vehicle sales. However, ride-sharing and transport network companies have not lowered car sales or even the number of vehicles on the road, but actually done the opposite. Multiple studies from New York, San Francisco, and other cities continuously reveal this to be the case. The death of cars was also greatly exaggerated. The millennial myth of them killing the car industry, just like many other things they're supposed to be killing, was just that, a myth. Millennials have simply delayed car purchase, just like they have delayed other things such as marriage, mostly due to situations such as recession and poor economic conditions. The National Bureau of Economic Research reported in a study that controlling for factors like marriage, urban versus rural living conditions, education, marital status, and number of children, millennials rack up slightly more VKTs, or vehicular kilometers traveled, than even baby boomers did. And the same OEMs and auto manufacturers that are talking about mobility and shared and service models are the same ones that are churning out feature-rich concept models. A great number of drivers take pride in vehicles and value extra comfort. These are the ones that drive more than 10,000 kilometers a year. They might require special accessories in their vehicles, or they use their cars as storage or lockers, carrying tools or dirty loads. Think of people who own pickup trucks, or new parents with babies and infant accessories such as seats and toys and cleaning supplies. There's also the huge issue of comfort. Shared vehicles will need to be designed to minimize cleaning and vandalism risks, which would incur additional costs. These will be a lot less comfortable without any leather upholstery or carpeted floors. They will also have fewer accessories such as sound systems, and they will also probably require more frequent cleaning and repairs. Passengers would also need to accept the fact that their activities would be recorded, so those who value privacy are not likely to use this model. And then there's a whole issue with sharing vehicles, sanitation and germs that's just been revealed by the recent pandemic. Ultimately, while the rideshare model might be the first one out the door, the trend could revert a few years after. Once transport network companies get everyone comfortable with automated vehicles and they have proven their safety, they could then be made with cheaper materials such as plastic, coupled with the fact that auto manufacturers would be the ones buying the insurance because they would be insuring the system as opposed to individual drivers insuring their driving ability. This would allow them to distribute the cost of the premium across the vehicle sold, ultimately reducing the price of individual vehicles so much that it is actually cheaper for everybody to have their own. This is a trend that has followed pretty much all electronics around the world. Many years ago, there was only one computer per household, and it was only the better-to-do households that could afford a computer. Eventually, they became cheap enough that every single person has one, and sometimes even more than one. So the most likely outcome could be something closer to the bike share model, where people that are subscribed and use bike shares use that out of convenience, but also own one or two of their own bikes and use those when it better suits their purpose. So with all these possible scenarios, how do we figure out which one is the one that's actually going to happen? How do we try to forecast what the future holds? There's actually several methods that try to reduce the wider spectrum of everything that's possible into what is actually more probable or likely to happen. One of these is the Delphi technique. This was a forecasting methodology developed by the RAND Corporation around the Second World War. To explain it briefly, this method consists of a group of experts that answer a series of surveys or questionnaires, and they respond to these individually. Then all the responses are collected and shared anonymously with the panel. They're then able to respond to the questionnaire again and adjust their answers based on the responses of their peers. And this repeats several times with the objective of gradually obtaining some degree of consensus in the responses. To illustrate this, here's an example from the survey we undertook. And as you can see through the several rounds, gradually there's a consensus forming, and you can see the broad range of responses narrowing into something a little more concise. The graphic was stretched out to accurately represent the passage of time. So let's examine the results of the first survey question that the experts provided a forecast to. Percent of penetration. How many of the vehicles on the road will be driven by humans, and how many vehicles will be driverless? As you can see, in the beginning, most experts agreed there will be very little vehicles that will be driverless and most driven by humans. However, this tends to increase with a broader range by 2070, somewhere between 20 to 90% of the vehicles, with most of them agreeing that it'll be somewhere between 40 to 60. Now, the most revealing part of this forecast is actually this crux right here, 10 years from now. Most experts agree that by the year 2030, around 10% of vehicles on the roads would be driverless. Another school of thought felt that this would be closer to 3%. Now, let me explain why these numbers are critical. Currently, in my city of Toronto, Uber comprises just over 3% of vehicles on the road. Now, everybody think back to 2015 and remember just how much disruption Uber brought to your city when they first rolled out. How did it disrupt the taxi industry, the transportation industry? What effects did it have on transit? What effects did it have on business models? How much did it disrupt the way business was run? Things like the sharing economy, the gig economy, Uber Eats. Think back to how much disruption something like Uber and Lyft brought with less than 3% of vehicles on the road. Now imagine 10 years from now what 3 to 10% of vehicles on the road being driverless would mean for your city. So what about the mode? What percentage of those driverless vehicles will be private and what percentage will be shared? There's two clear schools of thought. One thinks that right out of the gate, the majority of the vehicles will be shared, while another school of thought thinks that the majority of the vehicles will be private. Both of them coming to an agreement that 50 years from now, around 70 to 90% of the vehicles will be shared. The reasons cited for this included cost and liability, things as insurance, and that the leading developers such as Waymo, GM, Ford, Argo, Zoox, Uber are not talking about selling vehicles, but about offering a service instead. Now, what about the function of automated vehicles? How many of them will be moving people around and how many will be moving goods and services? Here we see even more divisive schools of thought at the start and slightly more consensus by the year 2070. Arguments for both include that there's a good business case to automate freight movement and that highways are actually an easier automation problem. If technology fails with cargo, it's less likely to result in a loss of life. On the flip side, cargo-only AVs will be slower to arrive as many non-passenger AV uses will still involve carrying a human attendant. Now, what about parking? What percentage of currently existing parking will remain, and what percentage of it will actually be repurposed? This graph is somewhat the reverse of previous ones. While most experts were in agreement at the beginning, there were two very distinct schools of thought created by the end of it. Most of them agreed that there would be no real significant changes before the year 2025, and the real shift would actually not start until 2030. Some of the arguments for both of the results include that regulations around parking minimums are very unlikely to change politically, at least for a decade. There also needs to be a dramatic shift towards shared vehicle use that actually exceeds increased parking demand from population growth. There will likely still be manually driven vehicles for a long time, and there would be new parking created in other areas like the periphery of the city, thereby not greatly affecting the total number of parking spots repurposed. Now, I want to introduce some very important caveats to this research study. Firstly, exponential growth is extremely hard to grasp. As we can see in this technology adoption in the US, adoption of innovation is an S-curve, and throughout the decades, it has taken less and less years for technology to become widely adopted. Exponential growth is extremely hard to mentalize. The most clear and evident example of this is COVID-19. Even though people saw the signal, saw the numbers, they could not fathom, not the speed, but the acceleration. It is very easy to make linear projections, but incredibly hard to foresee exponential growth. Similar things happened with Uber and Lyft in cities where authorities were too late to react, and by the time they did, they were well entrenched within these cities. Technological examples include Blockbuster reacting to Netflix and delaying until it was too late. So now what? Now that we have a clear understanding of all the things automated vehicles could do or do wrong, and now that we have a better idea as to how or how much, what do we need to do now? This is still really just the tip of the iceberg, and there's a lot more work that yet needs to be done, a lot more research and studies. There's many potential scenarios to explore, such as vehicles giving rides for free in exchange for advertisement or user-generated data. Such scenarios, for example, it would be beneficial to the vehicle to keep you stuck in traffic for longer because that would expose you to a greater number of advertisements, thus monetizing congestion. The longer you're in the car, the more data you will generate. We also need to stop wasting time on fake ethical dilemmas and direct it into real ones. Experts and the public alike are gripped by the primal emotional appeal of trolley problems, although the real practical use for designing automated vehicle behavior is null. Rodney Brooks, who's a former MIT robotics professor and the founder of iRobot, who makes Roomba, noted, ask yourself this question. How many times when you have been driving have you been forced to make a decision around who you need to kill? The 5 nuns or the single child, the bank robber or the little old lady? And every time you came across that decision, do you feel that you made the right decision in the heat of the moment? And what about your friends and family? How many times have they come across this decision? How many times have they had to make these types of decisions? And that's exactly the point. This made-up question will have no practical impact on automobiles or a person in the future. Just as these questions never come up for human drivers, they especially won't come up for driverless cars, who will have numerous other safeguards in place that human drivers do not. On top of this, a 2018 research article by the journal Nature surveyed 2.3 million people from around the world in 130 countries, and they confirmed that even morality is not universal. Human beings in different parts of the world have different opinions regarding on what is right and wrong. Companies building these cars will really be less concerned with the esoteric questions of right and wrong than with concrete questions of predictive legal liability. Instead of continuing to waste time and resources on these fruitless and hollow exercises, these should be devoted to figuring out what you want for your city. What practical, tangible things should automated vehicles be allowed or prohibited from doing in your jurisdiction? We need to have moral debates and collectively decide whether vehicles should stop to help people in need, whether they should travel at close to speed limits, maybe go above. What about emergencies? Should vehicles be able to double as an ambulance? Would they be able to? How about running red lights? Running red lights in an emergency? How about not accepting cash payments? What does that do for people that are unbanked or underprivileged? How is privacy maintained in these vehicles? Who is in charge of data collecting and storing, and who has rights over the data? These and many, many more concrete questions and debates are the ones we should be having. I also can't stress enough how urgent it is to begin exploring policies and regulations now, not when AVs are already circulating wildly in the roads. As I mentioned before, think back to just how much disruption Uber brought to cities worldwide with less than 3% of vehicles on the road. Now imagine what driverless vehicles are going to do with even greater numbers in 5 to 10 years. Obviously, traditional regulatory approaches won't work. These are very risk averse. They take too long because they strive to always get it perfect, and they will never be able to catch up to technology. But there are many new approaches to regulatory innovation that have already been proven to work. Things like RegTech and rules as code, experimentation, prototyping, sandboxes, pilots. Without investments these past 4 years, fixed route ridership has declined in most US cities by around 2% each year. Yet in the city of Toronto, the design of a major streetcar route through a pilot led to a 17% increase in transit ridership in just 1 year. These experiments, these pilots, these sandboxes, they need to happen now. We can do this with the current technology. We can test things such as curbside pricing incentives and disincentives, or dynamically priced PUDO locations based on demand, time of day, specific GPS precise locations. This could translate into a situation where, for example, if you want to be dropped off right in front of your downtown office during morning rush hour, you would have a fixed or percentile surcharge, let's say $30 on top of the regular price. If you choose to be dropped off at the corner, that might be reduced slightly. But if you choose to be dropped off at a less busy side street, this would be a smaller fraction charged. Conversely, if you live in the suburbs and choose to be dropped off at the nearest train station, your ride would have a discount applied to the base price, subsidized by the levies on downtown drop-offs. In addition, you could have specific regions digitally marked as no stopping locations for drivers, essentially digitizing the city's signage. Driver violators would get applicable city fines, and passengers could share the payment as well. We also need to regulate the terminology around automated vehicles and its use in marketing. Terms such as self-driving, driverless, autopilot, etc., these need to be regulated better than, or at least as thoroughly, as terms like organic, non-GMO, or low-fat, which are regulated by agencies across different countries. This egregiously misleading marketing has already led to multiple accidents and several deaths. And there's lots of work to be done in designing pickup and drop-off locations. While destinations such as airports or transit locations have already worked out several designs, another interesting place to look is suburban schools that have been forced to come up with interesting designs around pickup and drop-off locations known as kiss and drop. But the real challenge will be to design these for downtown streets. What happens when that movie or the show ends at that downtown theater and everybody runs out of the theater, out the main entrance, and expects their car to pick them up at the exact same time as everybody else? So there's still a lot to figure out. It's not going to be easy, and we are under the false impression that we still have a lot of time to figure it out. There's a very quickly narrowing window of time to course correct and revert the negative behaviors and developments that came about from the system of automobility. We have the opportunity to intervene before habits become entrenched and infrastructure is too deeply cemented. Keeping business as usual is not an option. We have to begin taking action now, not when driverless vehicles are all over our streets. COVID-19 should be a wake-up call to take the wheel before it is too late to course correct. Thank you.